Okay, so I know that people are continuing to join us online, but I'd like to take advantage of our time and start this event off. My name is Warren Mabey, and I am the director of the School of Policy Studies here at Queen's University. And on behalf of the school and on behalf of the faculty and the university, I would like to welcome all of you to this very special event, this very special talk. Before I begin with my opening remarks, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that Queen's University sits on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe peoples. My understanding of Cataraqui, which is this area that Kingston is built on, is that it is a place where for time immemorial, people have come together to hunt, to fish, to camp, but also to exchange ideas and exchange thoughts. And I've always hoped that Queen's University can pick up some of that tradition as a place where people can come together, share their ideas, share thoughts, and move forward. We're in a virtual space, and I know that those of you joining us may be on many different traditional territories across our country and in other parts of the world. Please do take a moment just to acknowledge that. Think of those that have come before and those who are on the land before our current civilization was sort of built up on top of those pillars. This lecture is the latest in a series. It's the Tom Courchene Distinguished Speaker Series, and it's supported by Margie and Tom Courchene, and it focuses on Indigenous policy and governance. Professor Courchene, Professor Emeritus here in the school, was the inaugural director of the School of Policy Studies. He's well known for his leadership here in the university, as well as the school. He was the director of the Institute for Intergovernmental Relations. Past lectures in the Courchene series include Jody Wilson-Raybould, Paul Martin, Cindy Blackstock, Nathan Obed, and Queen's current Chancellor, Murray Sinclair. And we want to take a moment to recognize and thank the Courchene family for their support for this speaker series. It's made wonderful conversations possible. And we're looking forward to this conversation as well. And this conversation is particularly meaningful. We are lucky enough to be joined by Her Excellency, the Right Honorable Mary Simon, who is now approaching her very first anniversary as Canada's first Indigenous Governor General. Governor General Simon was born in Nunavik. She was a radio broadcaster in the CBC before she took on a number of different roles with the Northern Quebec Inuit Association, with the Inuit Taparit Kanatami. She served 2 terms as president of the Inuit Circumpolar Conference, which is now the Circumpolar Council. She was the ambassador for Circumpolar Affairs from 1994 until 2003. And she served 2 terms as president of the Inuit Taparit Kanatami. She's been very active in her community. She has moved on behalf of children and education. She founded the Arctic Children and Youth Foundation, and she served as the chairperson on the National Committee on Inuit Education. I'm not going to read out the long list of honors that Her Excellency has received throughout her career. Suffice it to say that she brings a hugely distinguished record of service and dedication to her role. And I'm just so pleased that she was able to take time out of a very busy schedule to join us today. Thank you so much for being with us. In conversation today with our Governor General is Professor Bob Watts, who is the former interim director of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission and a long-standing adjunct professor with the School of Policy Studies, who is currently serving with the Board of Governors at Queen's University. And so thank you to Bob for facilitating this conversation. Thanks to everyone. And I'm going to turn things over to Professor Watts.
Thank you very much, Warren, for that kind introduction and for that really beautiful land acknowledgement. I also want to thank Margie and Tom Courchene. I can tell you a few years ago, I was teaching a class at Queen's and I look out over my classroom and Tom Courchene was sitting there as a student. And I pretty much froze when I saw someone as distinguished as Tom sitting in my classroom. And he said he was there to audit. And I told him, well, you have to do the work. You just can't audit. And he did. It took him an extra 2 years to finish his final paper, but the final paper ended up being a book. And I just want to recognize Tom and Margie as well, and to welcome all of you to this really, really special occasion. The Governor General of Canada, Her Excellency, the Right Honorable Mary Simon, first Indigenous Governor General, and as Warren talked about, such a distinguished career, so many accomplishments, so many firsts that are attributed to Her Excellency, and bringing all that knowledge and wisdom and experience to bear, and representing all of us in Canada in the very, very best way. So I don't want to go on any further. I want to create lots of room for Her Excellency to address us and to create space for all of us to engage with her later. So without any further ado, Your Excellency, if I could turn things over to you and welcome you to Queen's University.
Well, thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Bob, and it's wonderful to be here. And I also want to thank the Courchene family for setting up this very important process that we have in place to learn about different parts of the country. And I see that you've had some very impressive speakers who have delivered at the Thomas Courchene lecture. So first of all, I just want to say hello, bonjour, unlukut, unnusakut. I would like to first of all acknowledge that I am joining you today from Rideau Hall, which sits on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And also, again, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to join the very impressive list of speakers who have delivered the Thomas Courchene lecture. Throughout my life, I have navigated the bridge building needed between the academic community, policymakers, politicians, and opinion leaders. And now, as Governor General, I take on the role as a national bridge builder, connecting with Canadians and connecting them with each other. It is my hope that I can stretch our collective appreciation of Canada's foundations, which include the rich oral and cultural traditions found in the Arctic. We are, after all, an Arctic nation, and I'm so very proud to be the first Inuk and the first Canadian born in Inuit Nunangat to serve as Governor General. Je suis très fière d'être la première Inuit et la première Canadienne née dans l'Inuit Nunangat à être Governor General. Growing up, I walked in two worlds. The first was the Inuit world of my mother and grandmother. My siblings and I learned our culture, stories, and language, and how to live off the land. I learned to be proud of who I was, but at the same time, to keep my mind open to other points of view. We were also fortunate to learn from my father about our other world, the South, referring to the non-Indigenous world. My father, who was born in Manitoba and developed a profound love and respect for the Arctic and for Inuit. He also recognized and valued what the South could offer his family. Back and forth, during my life, I would walk over the bridge between these two worlds, using my knowledge of one to benefit the other, always with the goal of improving Inuit lives. And there was much to do. For decades, Inuit have experienced transition and upheaval. From a very young age, everything I learned helped me better understand the meaning of reconciliation and what being an Arctic nation means. Over the years, Canadian artists and authors have cemented the Arctic as part of our imagination, painting the region in a stark white brushstroke. Others have seen only the untapped potential of natural resources. So close your eyes, and what do you see when I say Canada, our North and Arctic nation? For many of you, a snowy tundra and landscape will come to mind. For Inuit, though, the Arctic is not a place of business or imagination. It is a lived-in homeland with deep ties to culture and identity. It is more than a landscape. It is home, where our families live, where we work and play. It is our life. But the North, and more specifically its people, were often an afterthought. The question becomes, how do we ensure the Arctic is part of our collective responsibility? Comment faire de l'Arctique notre responsabilité collective? By seeing our country through the eyes of the Arctic, a successful and prosperous Canada includes robust and sustainable northern communities. It includes contributions from Inuit and other Indigenous peoples, and it includes policies that bolster and address the wide-ranging challenges of living in the North. Incremental positive changes are already happening. We have settled numerous land claims treaties which grant Inuit ownership of large areas, some with full subsurface rights. There have also been milestones in recognizing the rights of Indigenous peoples. Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982, for example, explicitly recognizes and affirms the treaty rights of Aboriginal peoples of Canada and specifies the term Aboriginal peoples to include First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples of Canada. Or consider the creation of the new territory of Nunavut in 1999 and the establishment of the Nunavut government. Other milestones included Canada's ratification of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and its final calls to action, and the public inquiry on missing and murdered Indigenous women. And most recently, outside Canada, His Holiness Pope Francis delivered a long-awaited public apology regarding residential schools. The pain from residential schools remains and runs deep. Students were brought there after being ripped from their families and communities. There, many were severely abused. They lost their language and culture. Too many lost their lives. This apology is a first step, but it is just that, one step, and it's one that must be followed with action. On the road to reconciliation, we must always strive to acknowledge the pain and the truth of our history. It's about our stories, my stories, your stories, our people's stories, and hearing our truth will guide us forward. Because so much remains to be done, let us return our attention to the North. Consider this. From 2018, 34% of Inuit aged 25 to 64 have earned a school diploma, compared to 86% of all Canadians in the same age group. 70% of Inuit households in Nunavut are food insecure. It's 8% nationally. Life expectancy for Inuit is 72.4 years. It's 82.9 for the rest of non-Indigenous Canada. The difference in the median income between Inuit and non-Indigenous peoples in Inuit Nunavut sits at more than $68,000. And a suicide rate in the 4 Inuit regions that range from 5 to 25 times higher than Canada as a whole. These are grim and unacceptable numbers, and one could easily lose hope. For too long, policies were imposed by asking, What do we think is best for Inuit people, for Indigenous peoples? We need to rephrase that question. What do Inuit people believe is the best course for themselves? One question takes agency away, the other gives it back. It starts by looking at how public policy impacts Northern communities. Cela commence par étudier l'impact des politiques publiques sur la communauté du Nord. In 2017, I traveled across the Arctic, meeting leaders, youth, land claims organizations, community members and scientists, and many others. People from the North talking about solutions for the North. The final report that I submitted to the federal government, titled A New Shared Arctic Policy Model, embodies what the Thomas Courchene lecture series strives for: bridge building to move our country forward. I believe community wellness must drive the next period of sustainable development in the Arctic. Forward-looking policy discussion must reflect such issues as rising food prices and the alarming trend of children fostered to homes outside the community. And policy must address the excessive and unacceptable suicide numbers in the Arctic, what can only be described as a crisis, and the growing need for mental health and elder care. We cannot and should not wait to act. The report underscored that the future of the Arctic relied on principles of partnership developed through listening and working together with people in our Arctic communities. This report also echoed what has been, for me, a guiding principle throughout my working life: that reconciliation is not one project, nor does it have an end date. It is a continuing process of understanding and respect. We must pursue partnerships and policy making that includes reconciliation. We must commit to building and restoring relationships, to seeing things differently than before, and to valuing Indigenous knowledge. We must also examine policy approaches for nature and environmental conservation in the Arctic. This is particularly vital as we continue to confront climate change. Addressing this issue can also be a tool for healing and reconciliation. This may involve supporting communities and individuals in regaining land-based life skills, reconnecting youth with their cultural traditions and language, recognizing and including Indigenous knowledge in decision-making, and guaranteeing that there will always be places and lands to call home. Sustainable development and environmental protection of the Arctic and its peoples was the impetus for forming the Arctic Council in 1996. As Canada's ambassador for circumpolar affairs at the time, I was engaged in the process, representing Canada and working with other 7 Arctic nations to find common ground for discussion and agreement. We also agreed on the participation of international Indigenous organizations, and there are currently 6 seats at the Arctic Council for Indigenous people. The Arctic connects us all, regardless of borders and boundaries. A warming climate is changing the nature and environment of the Arctic, opening up Arctic waters and altering our connectivity with northern communities. It is also impacting the traditional way of life for Inuit. It is clear no one country can go it alone. It requires cross-border collaboration. That is why diplomacy, particularly through the Council, is vital. Today, Russia's heartbreaking invasion of Ukraine has stalled work on the Arctic Council, but confronting these issues cannot wait. we must find a way forward, urging dialogue over conflict. Inuit and other Indigenous peoples need opportunities and the resources to succeed. When that happens, we will live up to our reputation as a diverse, tolerant, and equal society. In everything, it comes back to the truth. I have given you a snapshot of what happens in the North, a glimpse into the Inuit experience, but it's only a small fraction of the Arctic and Inuit history. I encourage you now to seek out the truth of our history and ask yourself, how can I shift my view, not to a Canada of the North, but to see Canada from the North? I mentioned earlier that it's easy to lose hope, but hope is not lost. It's never lost as long as we dedicate ourselves to action. L'espoir n'est pas perdu. During my travels as an Inuit leader and as an ambassador and now as Governor General, I have seen examples of strong local leadership transforming communities one step at a time. And not just elected representatives, leaders can be community leaders, public servants, negotiators, advocates, and policy or other type of specialists. They are educators, small business owners, and elders. I see leaders everywhere when they're given the tools and opportunities to succeed. I also see leaders when I look at all of you, young people, who speak out about issues of diversity, equality, mental health, nature, and the environment, and who are champions of culture, education, language, and reconciliation. We all share a role, not only in developing and implementing Arctic policy, but also in reshaping our views of our country and the diverse people who call this land home. There is a word in Inuktitut, an important concept for Inuit with no direct translation. Ayuinata. Ayuinata is the word that I'm talking about. Its essence is a promise, never to give up. It's committing ourselves to action, no matter how daunting the cause may be. Indigenous peoples are relying on you to meet this important moment in history. Continue to educate yourselves on Inuit and more broadly, Indigenous history. Listen to their stories. Embed reconciliation in your work, and let us all work in the spirit of Ayuinata towards understanding, respect, and reconciliation. I now look forward to hearing from you, your thoughts, your questions, and your hopes and dreams for our country. Thank you, merci, miigwech, nakokmik.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for such a wonderful and broad-ranging speech and talk and encouragement to all of us. We're going to open things up for questions, but I've been given the honor of asking you the first couple of questions to get things going. So just reflecting back on the work that you've done for so long and leadership that you've displayed, thinking back to your time as president of the Inuit Tapiriat Kanatami, which focuses on the advancement of Inuit rights. Can you share with us about how you ensured that Inuit rights were at the center of all the decision-making that you were asked to do and working with your executive leadership? How did you do that focus? How did that work?
Thank you, Bob, for that question. A very important one. It goes back to our culture and the way we do things. We go back to our elders to talk to them about what we think needs to be done. We were given the responsibility by our elders to go out and and work and negotiate new agreements for our people. So when we started that work, we often went back to our elders to talk to them about the approach that we were taking. And that approach would always be embedded in our identity as a people, the fact that we have never given anything up. We have historically lived in the Arctic for thousands of years. And based on that foundation, we were able to go back out into our discussions with different governments in Canada and always stayed true to those principles of decision-making, principles of ownership, principles of our identity related to our culture and our language. And I think that was the strength that we had, because we were a small group of people and we had to endure great commitment and a tremendous amount of time away from our communities and our families. And it was through that strength that we were given from our elders that we were able to continue until, you know, we had different things in place. The land claims agreement was just part of the process. Once those land claims were agreed to, then we had to set up all the infrastructure, the school boards, the regional governments, the health board. There were so many things that had to be set up, and we ensured that the relevant provisions in these agreements were reflective of the institutions that we were building. And it was often a situation where we had to sometimes renegotiate those provisions, but because in the final agreement, they may or may not have been clear enough in terms of accurately what we had agreed to. So there was often many more levels of discussions after that, as you probably know that, Bob. But nevertheless, it still goes on today. I don't think that it really ever ends. I mean, different agreements like the land claims treaties are a stepping stone, or they're more like a stepping stone that allows, let's say, my people to move in the direction that they want to see. So that was really one of the very foundational things that we did.
Thank you for that answer. At one point in your talk, Your Excellency, you asked us to close our eyes and imagine. And then you talked about having a lens, like a decision-making lens that takes into account the North, takes into account the Inuit peoples. And I'm wondering if you can expand on that a bit from maybe a decision-making point of view for government, for us as individuals. What would that lens look like? Or maybe some questions we might ask ourselves for decision-making that could better take into account the North and Inuit peoples.
Thank you, Bob. Yes, I think when we look back on the history of the country, we weren't well known by people that came to Canada historically. And when you look at the residential school era, most people that I've talked to that are in their older years, that like my age group, didn't know there were residential schools. So the history of the country wasn't inclusive, and the acts of government were not known by people. So I think that part of me asking you to close your eyes and looking through a lens is saying to you or to others that you need to learn more about the identity of the different Indigenous peoples in the country. We need to teach our youth the real history of the country. And I think that by doing that and learning and teaching each other about our stories and the historical relationship that evolved, that we will be in a better place to make decisions that will be better for the Indigenous people as well as for the country. I think, part of my role is to work through this reconciliation lens, and working through this reconciliation lens for me has meant that I have to go out and listen to people's stories and learn from them, and to be able to bring that story into a place where it's safe to talk about it, it's safe to have a difference of opinion, it's safe to we need to give space to healing, we need to give space for mental health healing, for other types of healing, and then allowing each of us to be able to comfortably show respect for one another without racism, without judging people, and to respect and learn to live side by side while allowing all of us to have opportunities like everybody else. And I think that level playing field we haven't reached that. And the opportunities that are still not available to Indigenous people, including Inuit in the Arctic, whether it's education or whether it's training opportunities, whether it's healthcare, whether it's better education, curriculum development in terms of our own culture and our own language. Those are all things that really need to be carefully considered in the evolution of our relationship. Just because we've had all this negativity going on in the history of the country doesn't mean that we can't come to a better place where we are building a stronger country by being more respectful of one another, by giving each other an opportunity to be who we are and to have the same opportunities as other Canadians in the economy, in the healthcare, in education, all those different areas. So that's what I mean when I say, close your eyes and see what you see.
Thank you for that, Your Excellency. Early on in your talk, you talked about navigating bridges, cultural bridges, maybe other social types of bridges. And then you referred to yourself as a national bridge builder. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that in terms of that idea about being a national bridge builder, and what you need from us in order to help you be that magnificent bridge builder.
I think bridge building is something that a lot of people do, and without realizing it, we are building bridges, I think, all the time. But to be sometimes a national builder, you have to get out of your comfort zone. And I've been out of my comfort zone quite a few times in my in my life. And sometimes you have to go through some adversity when you do that. And I think learning from adversity you go through as a person helps you build a stronger character if you can get through that adversity. And I can just remember when we were doing the constitutional negotiations back in the 80s, how we were all called Aboriginal peoples. And yet we were trying to tell governments that we were not all the same, that we had distinct identities as Inuit, as First Nations, as Métis. And because of the colonization process, we kind of treated each other like strangers. Aboriginal peoples, like here, there, and we were over here. And as we went into the constitutional negotiations, I started to realize more and more that I had to talk to First Nations, I had to talk to the Métis, And I had to come back and talk to my delegation about what everybody was doing and talking about. And I think that's how we had a unified voice in the end when when the Section 35 was recognized. And I think, you know, that's, to me, that's the kind of thing you do when you come out of your comfort zone and you take chances as to whether people are going to talk to you or not. But in the end, I think there's been, in my life anyway, a number of times where I've been able to do that. The Arctic Council was another example when I fought for the Indigenous peoples to have status in the Arctic Council. I had to come out of my comfort zone, even though I was the ambassador for circumpolar affairs. So I think that's what I mean by being a bridge builder.
Okay, thank you for that. Have a question from a member of the audience, and it actually goes to the Arctic Council. So this question is, could you please speak to the essential role the permanent participants in the Arctic Council play in ensuring that the Arctic is an integral part of our collective responsibility internationally?
So when we first started talking about the Arctic Council way back when, now in 1994, we took the position that, and we lobbied the government fiercely by telling them that the Arctic Council wouldn't work if it didn't include Indigenous people. And the reason for that was that, you know, we had been working on environmental protection, but the Arctic Council was bringing in a more robust agenda, which included sustainable development. So throughout the discussions, of course, some of the countries weren't in favor of the permanent participant status. They were more in favor of having us as observers, like the United Nations, you know, the process that we have at the United Nations. But it was clear after being involved in the United Nations that observer status isn't the way we wanted to go. So, and yet we understood that we couldn't either be the status of nation states. So we had to find a way somehow in between which would allow Indigenous organizations to be at the table with ministers every 2 years, and then in between ministers, the meetings that took place in preparing and doing all the work that was needed. So we were able to get that at the end. And what it brings to, in my view, is that it brings a voice that was not there before. It brings a voice that talks about the realities of the communities across the Arctic, whether they be Inuit or First Nations across the Arctic in the Yukon and so on, and also, you know, the Greenlandic Inuit, the Inuit from Russia, from Alaska. It brings that the reality of what the communities are experiencing and what is confronting them, and also to talk about what the possibilities are in terms of sustainable development, not just in terms of resources, but sustainable development in relation to our communities. That, you know, when you talk about sustainability, we're talking about a community that is engaged in many aspects of everyday life. But a lot of our services are inadequate. Housing is truly inadequate in the North. And it's always a way for Indigenous people to be able to present those cases at the Arctic Council. So it's a very significant voice that Indigenous people play. The problem we have, and I think I haven't been involved in the Arctic Council for some time, but when I was involved, part of our problem was that we didn't have resources for the permanent participants, or very little. So there was never enough resources to be able to prepare the way we would want to prepare for these meetings. So it was always a bit of a compromise to go to these meetings without the full engagement that we felt we should have. But nevertheless, it has always been very much supported by Indigenous communities across the Arctic and also by the government. We found out, or the governments may have found out, that by keeping Indigenous people outside the tent, there was always discussion about what terrible things they were doing. Or if you actually include people in these discussions, you can find solutions to the problem.
Mhm.
So I think that's one of the things that, that became clear throughout the whole process. I mean, they don't always agree. Like it's not like it's a consensus organization, but Indigenous organizations don't always agree with government. So that's a good thing.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that. And we have another question from one of our audience members, and it has to do with, I think, you talking about Indigenous knowledge and Inuit knowledge, which of course can contribute to in so many different ways in terms of sustainability and a better Canada. But the question is, the Inuit have interesting approaches to consensus-based decisions. What can non-Indigenous people learn from these approaches?
Well, consensus is something that we've always worked with as Inuit. And I think a lot of other Indigenous peoples have also done the same thing. And I think that when you look at historically how our cultures evolved, it was always done in conjunction with the community. We didn't have like communities like we have now, but we used to have groups of people living in different parts of the Arctic where they traveled with the seasons. But it was a knowledge base that was extremely important for the survival of the people. So consensus on the history of the land, the history of the people, and the teachings of the people was a critical component of the decision-making process. So that allowed us to be consensus-based. When you look at my recent trip to the Middle East, we talked a lot about diplomacy. How can we engage with different nations to promote better relations between countries, better diplomacy, so that we're not always reacting to a crisis, but rather working on preventative measures. And I think that kind of a concept is something that is very much a part of my culture anyway. And I think it's all based on things that you can agree on. So having different parties, I'm apolitical right now, so I can't really engage in a political conversation. But when you look at political parties around the world, they're engaged in disagreements all the time, but I've always tried to advocate for something different. I've always advocated for, I suppose we call it bridge building, but it's to try and reach agreement on certain very important issues without having everybody agreeing like 100%. But if you can get the majority of a group of people to agree on a way forward, then you do it that way. And I think, to me, that is consensus building. And that's what the Arctic Council does. It's a consensus-based organization, but the countries don't always agree like 100%. But if the majority of the countries agree and the Indigenous peoples agree, then they will move forward on any given issue. So that's kind of like how I see it.
Great, thank you for that answer. One of the things that you talked about in this next question, I think, speaks to that, and that's increasing the knowledge of people from the southern parts of Canada about the North. and about the Inuit in particular. And I'm just wondering if you have any favorite readings that or recommendations, books that you might suggest that we pay attention to help us get a better appreciation, both for the North and for Inuit people in particular.
Well, there's a number of publications that I've read through. I don't have any in front of me, but we don't have a lot of Inuit authors. We have some, but we don't have a lot. And that, I think, has to do somewhat to the fact that we have different writing systems across the Arctic. Inuit in Labrador, and Inuit where I come from in Nunavik, and Inuit that live in the Central Arctic. We all have different writing systems. Some of us have syllabics, like where I come from, and the Eastern Arctic, we use syllabics. In Labrador, they use orthography, but it's different from the orthography in the Western Arctic. So there are different elements of how our writing system has been introduced into our culture, because it's not, our culture is oral. Our history is oral history, and I think that I've always advocated for the unification of our writing system, because I think that a unification of our writing system would allow us to get more into that field of writing, and whereas more people would read through some of our books, but also it would also, I think, strengthen our education system, because right now, there's always a lack of resources for cultural development, for curriculum development, and sometimes we can't share what we've done with other regions. Therefore, the education system is not standardized across the Arctic. It's always dependent on where you live and how the education system has evolved. But we'd like to see a much more unified system. And in fact, we'd like to see an Inuit Nunangat University in the North, based on Inuit culture and identity, where everybody can come and educate themselves about Inuit culture and Inuit identity. I think that's the part where, knowing more about Inuit, knowing more about who we are, and being able to go to an academic institution that is based on Inuit culture and identity would be a really big improvement in being able to share our knowledge. And, when you look at the Sami people in the Scandinavian countries, they have a Sami university. I don't know if you've ever been there, Bob, but it's quite an amazing institution.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that, Your Excellency. You're well-traveled, and you've seen change both in this country and in other countries. When you look around the world, are there other countries that you would say stand out as perhaps a good model for Canada to be looking at and examining in terms of how we move forward as Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples?
It's sometimes difficult to compare, because I think certain things have advanced in Canada where other countries haven't. We've been able to negotiate treaties, the comprehensive new treaties, and in some countries they haven't been able to do that. Whereas, like when you look at Greenland, they have their home rule government, and that's quite advanced, and they've been able to really, run their own affairs for a very long time. They're not independent from Denmark, but they have a lot of independence, and they're still aspiring to become independent. And then you look at the Sami people in the Scandinavian countries and how they've been fighting for a land base so that they can negotiate land claims agreements. And then you look at, the Russian Arctic, which is completely different as well. So it's really difficult to compare which country has the best solution. Like, I think Canada is one of the countries that has been able to negotiate land claims, comprehensive land claims treaties. And whereas in other countries, I haven't seen that the way we have done it. Like, we have comprehensive claims now all across the Arctic for Inuit, for all the Inuit regions. And that has allowed us to develop our institutions in the North and to be able to get closer to being able to managing our own affairs. We're not there yet, but one day it will be there. And then we have, like, when you look at New Zealand, that's a country that has evolved in terms of its education. And I've been told many times how difficult it was for Maori when they lost their language and had to make some very adverse decisions to bring their language back and their own culture into their schools. And now, from what I can hear, everybody wants to be able to speak Maori, all New Zealanders. So that's another, thing that you look at and see, which I want to learn more about that to see what they've done. So hopefully I'll get to New Zealand at some point as well. So it's really hard to compare, like, because different things have happened in different regions of the circumpolar Arctic.
Thank you. The next question I have here really goes to the question of language. I thought it was interesting about the Maori language. I remember being part of a delegation hosted in Geneva by the New Zealander ambassador to the United Nations there. And he greeted everybody in Maori, and many of his staff spoke Maori. And I thought, what an amazing thing that country representatives speaking Indigenous languages, and just imagining that catching on to other countries. One of the questions has to do with this importance of language and the power of language, and just asking you to maybe reflect on the importance and power of language as it relates to Inuit identity and relationship or connection to the land.
It's really one of the critical components of Inuit culture. Unfortunately, because of colonization, because of residential schools, many people lost their language, and they've had to pay that price, not being able to speak it. I'm very fortunate. I grew up in a family where we only spoke Inuktitut because my mother and my grandmother were both unilingual Inuit that didn't speak English, and my father was very fluent in Inuit, in the Inuktitut language. So to me, language is at the core of who we are, because when it comes to the traditional lifestyle of Inuit, our language is very much tied to the environment and the land and the waters and the animals and the fish that, that we evolved around in terms of our lives in the Arctic. And that hasn't changed to a great degree, except now, we have food insecurity because people are not able to go out hunting because of climate change, because of a lot of other elements related to the sort of the destruction of the true culture of the people. And that goes back to many incidences that have caused that. And I could spend another hour talking about those, but I'll just talk about the importance of language for a moment. I'm learning French right now, and I've realized that if you haven't learned the language as a child, it's difficult to learn a language. And if you've learned to speak your language as a child and you lose it, it's probably even more difficult to get it back, because there's a lot of trauma associated with losing your language, because you were traumatized throughout your childhood, and you may or may not want to go back to that place. So there's a lot of that, but at the same time, I think people realize more and more today that we need to bring back our languages. There's a lot of, I think, time and effort that's happening in the communities to try and ensure that our languages don't disappear. A lot of languages in Canada, Indigenous languages, have become extinct. And I can see our language, Inuktitut, which is considered one of the strongest languages, Indigenous languages in Canada, it's also getting weaker. It's becoming a lot weaker when you listen to the youth using the language. They use English and Inuktitut at the same time. And that shows that your language is becoming weaker and weaker. So I've been I've always advocated for better support for languages, because it's not just about retaining, it's about helping your language grow as you grow as a people into different types of ways of living. So language is a very important part of who we are.
Great, thank you for that answer, Your Excellency. With language, there was a question early on that I thought was really interesting, and it talked about sort of that juxtaposition of hope and good life. And in several Indigenous languages, there's a notion of a good life, like Bamadzuan, or the peace. Is the peace with you? Is the peace in your heart? Is there an Inuit word for that idea of good life, and what does that mean? What's the Inuit view on that good life?
Well, it depends on who you talk to sometimes. The older generation still ties very closely to the traditional way of life, even though life has changed for them. They still very deeply associate themselves to the traditional culture. The younger generation, I think, sees life a bit differently, because they see that in order to succeed in this country now, you pretty much have to go get a good education, and to get a higher education academically, and to be able to go to post-secondary. And I think I find that, like, all my nephews and nieces that are in their 20s and 30s are really involved in making sure their children are in school every day. And that changes your lifestyle quite a bit, because you have to be in the communities at least 5 days a week, even if you're going to go out on the land 2 days a week, which is usually on the weekend. And it's really about adjusting in these two worlds that I talked about earlier, living in two worlds, being able to live in two worlds without losing your culture and your language, but to be able to function in another language and in a different culture. Because when you come, as you know, down here to the south, I've had to make a big adjustment at Rideau Hall,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and those adjustments that you make up part of who you are, and without losing who you are as a person. Like, I'm an Inuk first and foremost, but I live in two worlds. And I think that's the kind of thing that the younger generation is seeing more and more of, because they are learning to speak another language, whether it be French or English. and their own language. That's really the important part that they really want to teach in their in their schools, to be able to teach, not just teach the language, but to use it in the school.
Yeah.
So the word that I spoke about earlier, which is ayuinata, is a similar kind of word. Like I told you, there's not one meaning to it. Ayuinata could mean, let's hope for a better future. Let's not give up what we have for something else. It's that kind of interpretation that is really like, and that's why I use it so much. I mean, that's one of my, that's a word I used to hear all the time when I was growing up. The older folks used to visit with each other, and then when they were leaving, they'd say, "Ayuinata," like, let's keep going, let's not give up. So it's a similar kind of word.
I love that. I think that's what a way to both greet and to leave somebody's company.
Yeah.
With such words. One of the things that you've talked about, and I know folks are interested in, is the relationship of Indigenous knowledge, and in particular Inuit knowledge, and some of the challenges that we're facing as a world today with respect to climate change and sustainability. And I'm just wondering if you can expand on that a bit from your experiences and some of the things that are happening in the Arctic to really move that agenda forward in terms of sustainability and dealing with climate change.
Yes, my good friend Sheila Wapuche says climate change is a human right, and I think that's a very important way of saying it in relation to Inuit knowledge, and the relationship we have with the natural environment and what surrounds us. Inuit knowledge, I think, hopefully can play a critical part in terms of understanding our relationship with the land, nature, and the environment, not just climate change, but nature and the environment. Try and look to see where we can be more engaged and positive about our own environment and our nature around us, and to appreciate that as much as we can. And Inuit knowledge, or our Indigenous knowledge, in the past, I think it's changing somewhat, because scientists have seen more and more that by working together with Indigenous scholars or scientists or Inuit that are doing research, they have found that working with more than one knowledge base can be more beneficial than trying to work with one knowledge base, which is the true, like the hard sciences. Maybe this other knowledge base is also critical in terms of decision making, as an example, in relation to climate change. We don't cause the climate change that's happening in the north, but we are being impacted greatly by it. And the fact that, the small island states are being impacted by the melting ice of the ice caps is something that people don't really think about very much, but it is connected, and it is impacting on the way of life of people in the small island states, in addition to how it is impacting Inuit and other northerners in the Arctic. So those kind of connections, and how do you address those connections, and whether you can in fact still continue working on mitigation, or are we at the stage now we have to look at adaptation? Because in the north now, people are talking about adapting to change because there's no real control as to how we can stop what's happening right now. But we do want to be part of the solution for sure. And part of the solution is to not always just document Inuit knowledge or Indigenous knowledge into documents and reports, but to actually work with people that are working in those fields and work with them in such a way that where you will bring decision making in a different way. And I know that, you know, some universities, and maybe Queen's has done some of that work, but I know that it's something that people used to talk about, only talk about, and not really take it seriously. But maybe we're getting into a phase where it's being considered more seriously.
Let's hope that that's true, and I think there's evidence of that, and that's a hopeful thing. One of the things that we see, and I think part of this has to do with the wonderful work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and the knowledge that people have gained about truth from those 215 children in Kamloops, and then many thousands more as work has been done at other residential schools. You know, the country has gone through just an incredible range of emotions from that. But one of the things that I'm seeing is increasingly a desire for non-Indigenous people to engage in reconciliation, and sometimes maybe not sure how best to engage and how to support, or maybe how to be a good ally. And I'm just wondering if you have some thoughts on that might help us all think about our role in this journey of reconciliation.
Yeah, that's very important. I think when they first found the unmarked graves in Kamloops, there was a reawakening in the country that this is something that became real to many people. And therefore, I think a lot of non-Indigenous Canadians realized that this was something that needed to be dealt with. And I think people are ready to work on reconciliation. When I was appointed last July, I received many thousands of messages just indicating that, you know, people were ready to work on reconciliation. So that I have, you know, I feel that I have a big role to play in that, and I will be playing a big role in that. But at the same time, I think we as a country, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, we have to reach out to our neighbors, reach out to our families, talk to our children about some of the history of the country and what we need to do to bring it together. And I think that, you know, by doing that, and not just going once, because if you have an initial discussion with somebody, you know, you may or may not get anywhere, but just because you don't get anywhere doesn't mean you shouldn't go back and talk to them again. And I think that's really important amongst our own communities and our towns and cities. More and more people need to reach out. Reconciliation, as I said earlier, is a Canadian issue. It's all of our all of us are responsible for working towards reconciliation. The other thing that Canadians can do, I think, is talk to your members of parliament. Talk to the representative in your riding, the members there, and ask them to talk to their other members in the House of Commons or in the Senate and to talk about it in a way where you start to bring about a common understanding of what you're talking for, why you're doing it, and not always just react to a piece of proposed legislation. That conversation needs to take place. And there are many ways of going forward on that. You know, we'll be involved in reaching out to all the provinces, to the non-Indigenous community, to the Indigenous community. I plan to go to many places. But I also feel that I need to say to people I work with across the country that we all have a role to play. And that role can be, I suppose, whatever you can make of it. Like if it just means talking to your children about what you know, that's important. It doesn't have to go beyond that if you can't do any more. But if you can go way beyond that, then then you should do that. And if you can encourage, if you're involved in an organization or a business or any kind of activity in the country, if you're an employee in that organization or that business, you can encourage others to form groups where you can talk about it. Or if you're the head of an organization or a business, you can say, we're going to have a program regarding reconciliation and implement that agenda within your organization. That's really advancing reconciliation in this country. So there's, I think, a lot of different ways that people can reach out and work together. There's many forms it can take.
Thank you so much for that. That's really inspiring. I have two more questions, and then I'm going to turn things back over to Warren, and just to acknowledge your incredible generosity and spending time with us here, Your Excellency. So my second last question is, are there better ways to engage Canadians in learning more about the North? Like, are there systemic things that we should be looking at that can really engage a lot more people all at the same time in learning and creating an understanding and awareness about the North?
Well, I think part of the impediment that we have is the cost of living in the North, like going to the North. If you have 2 weeks where you would like to go to the North, you find yourself having to pay a great deal of money for airfares, a great deal of money to just live in the North for a couple of weeks. So it's difficult, I think, for the average Canadian to learn, by going there, to learn more about the people and the North. So I think universities need to have more programs about the North, about, sometimes I've learned, like when I was the chancellor at Trent, they had an Indigenous program. It was a very good program, and it was called Indigenous. But when I looked into it, there was hardly anything on the Arctic. It was nobody's fault. Nobody had the expertise or the knowledge to be able to integrate that. But I think universities should find a way to make sure that when we talk about Indigenous programs, if you're calling them Indigenous, then there should be a variety of things that you can do, which includes getting to know the Arctic, getting to know more about the people, not just Inuit, but because there's many different peoples living in the Arctic, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and also non-Indigenous peoples have made the North their permanent home. So I think these are things that we can look at. There's a lot of publications that may not have been written by Indigenous people, but they're still very relevant in many ways. So if you can find books related to the North. I won't promote my husband's book, but he's got a really good book too. True North Rising. I mean, I just mentioned it. I'm not promoting it in any way, but that's about the North, across the North, that he has seen over his some 50 years of broadcasting. So things like that, where you learn things, you know, like, and yeah, well, that, I'm not sure what else I can say.
Okay, that's great, Your Excellency, and given that you are in that position of not promoting the book, I'll promote the book. Please go out, buy the book. It's a tremendous resource and source of knowledge for all of us. You know, clearly, Your Excellency, you're a person of huge vision and courage and never give upness. And I'm just wondering, what when you cast your mind forward a few years, what are you looking forward to? What are you seeing?
I hope to see a place where we live called Canada that not only aspires to be a better country, but is a better country, where people can live faithfully, people can live side by side without judgment, people can live with equal opportunity, whether it be education or other services that we take for granted as Canadians. And having a place where our stories are being told, each of our stories, and to teach our children a history that may or may not always be good, but a history that is true. Telling the truth is very important. Telling the history of the country to our children is so important, because when they get to be our age and younger, I'm an elder now, by the way, Bob. When our children grow up and become leaders of Canada, they will have a better understanding of what this country is all about. They will have a better sensitivity to the people that live here, which includes Indigenous people, the original people of this land, and be able to have a place in our country where we truly belong, without giving up who we are. That's what I envision.
I love that vision, and thank you for sharing that with us. Again, it's just been such an honor, Your Excellency, to spend some time with you and to hear all these such thoughtful and wise expressions. To make Wetch and Yawagoa for sharing with us and for being part of our circle. I'm going to turn things back over to Warren to move things forward.
Well,
Warren?
Bob, it's great to see you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you, Professor Watts. And thank you, Your Excellency, for what has been a moving and informative and really a wonderful session. I want to say that there were many questions asked in our Q&A. We were not able to get to all of them. For those of you online who have stuck with us and posted questions, apologies if we couldn't get to everything that you've asked. We've tried to address as much as we can. I really appreciate the time and the effort that the whole Governor General's office has put into making this event happen. Again, thank you to Professor Watts, and of course, thank you to our Governor General. Your Excellency, it's been wonderful to host you here. I only hope that we can do it in person so you can hear the thunderous applause that would come after your address. So with this, I would like to close this talk. Thank you again to everyone who's taken part. We are looking forward to another series next year. But in the meantime, I hope everyone stays well, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next event. Thank you all. Have a
Bye,
great
everybody.
Bye.